Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. It doesn't matter how long you've been playing tabletop RPGs, we've all been newbies at one point or another. It can be a little overwhelming with all of the rules, numbers, stats, etc. Usually there will be someone there with a bit more experience in the space to help you along and point you in the right directions. Though sometimes, these experienced players can have a bit of an inflated ego and feel like they are better than thou, which unfortunately is the case in these next 3 D&D horror stories. But first, I must ask that you roll a crit on that like button, comment, and subscribe to help appease the algorithm dragon yet again, as he's made a sudden return to the land of Doge and he's pretty hungry this time. You've helped stave him off thus far, but once again, I am asking for your help. Anyway, with that said, let's get right into the stories. Experienced Player Ruins Our Campaign by Reddit user Hentai. About 3 years ago, me and 2 of my close friends spontaneously decided to get into D&D 5e. I played a Simic hybrid alchemist artificer, one friend played a dragonborn cleric of the light domain, and the other friend took it upon himself to DM. We came to the agreement very early on that the campaign would be very light and fun, not too strict on the rules for the sake of enjoying it. We played this way for several months, several nights a week, playing for hours and hours at a time. Eventually, we got to the point in the game where we decided to make a push towards properly playing the game. However, with only 2 players, this got a little too tough for a DM to balance. Cue another friend of mine, who happens to have been playing D&D for about 5 years now. Genuinely a good guy. I'd known him my whole childhood, and happened to know he has a collection of books published. Hell, he even ran a D&D club in high school. He agreed to join us. He had a day of the week open, and we pushed it down to 1 day a week just for him to play. He came in with a Goblin Ranger with the sharpshooter feat. We didn't think anything of it, as we happened to remember that Ranger was considered to be the worst class to play. So we assumed that he was taking one for the team in sense of letting us have the light. Very honorable. But we very quickly found out that this wasn't the case. This particular goblin had the social skills of an entitled child, who has had everything given to them, turning every statement into some sort of demand, and every question into an order. Very soon, every NPC recognized our group as assholes who should be shunned. Frustrating, yes, but it wasn't enough to make us stop playing, and we could have simply talked this over, but nope. Because every justification he made was, what I know now as the cliché, "It's what my character would do." Okay, fine. We'll just take this on the chin and push forward. Until the goblin started taking items very obviously rewarded for one of us. Can you tell me what a bow-wielding ranger does with gauntlets of ogre power? No? Me neither. Or what about stealing my ring of spell storing so he can pack in a bunch of goodberry casts? Smart, yes, but just stealing it was definitely uncalled for. I kept quiet about my problems with the way he was playing until the day he engaged an encounter very obviously deadly, almost gets the party killed, and ridiculed the DM style of ruling when the situation wasn't going his way, and blamed our characters for being useless. We ended the session early that night, and the following morning I expressed my distaste in the Ranger and the way he plays. We agreed to kick him from the group, and I've yet to speak with him since. The Dragonborn joined the Air Force, and we speak every now and then. As for me and the DM, we both run campaigns, each of us as players in the other. And I hope the Ranger found a party that fits his playstyle. Thanks for reading. It's one thing to be experienced in something and going into a game with newbies to help guide them on how to play better. It's another thing entirely to come in and just be a general asshat and take advantage of other players' inexperience. To take items meant for other players, and even stealing them because you think you could use it better, is pretty scummy. D&D is supposed to be about fun, first and foremost, and if your idea of fun impedes on the fun of everyone else playing, you are not an experienced player in my book. Though, that's just this Doge's take. What would yours be? On to the next story. Me and how my, quote, stupid build got killed. By Reddit user Akire Flame. Hey there, this is my first time posting on this sub, so I'm sorry for any formatting mistakes, and if this is long. I've recently began listening to more tabletop RPG horror stories on YouTube, and hopefully now you have a new channel to watch. Which made me remember this one game I played in 2020 before the fateful month of March. Quick context. At this time, I barely knew anything about things like D&D and only really started getting into it during quarantine with some online friends on Discord. About a year before this event took place, I only had played a single session of Hoard of the Dragon Queen when sleeping over at a friend's house, and the DM had done most of the work with my character creation, which also birthed one of my most favorite D&D characters to play ever. This event also took place before I moved states, so I was a part of some video game club at my high school. It was a club that was mainly made up of nerdy guys, with only a few girls, me being one of the girls. But we got along really well. Okay, context over. One of the days I went to the club, I noticed that there were also a handful of the guys talking about D&D stuff, and I asked them about it. They said they were just discussing this next session that was coming up in the school's D&D club. It had been a while since I played something like D&D, and I remembered how awesome Hoard of the Dragon Queen was, so I asked if I could join the club as well. They, of course, said yes. They also said that I would have to make my own character sheet prior to the next club's meet, since they would be doing a session, but would happily insert my character into the adventure. Of course, I was very excited. The guys had also told me that this was a session one-shot where everything was allowed, including any homebrew, a term I didn't know at the time. This should have been a small red flag, but my ignorance waved it off as I had perceived D&D as a game where you could be literally anything you want. So I was left on my own with character creation. I looked up some of the basic D&D rules, such as how to roll for stats, and what classes and races I could choose from. I remembered playing a sorcerer in Hoard of the Dragon Queen, so I chose that. I also chose a dragonborn as my race, only because my dumbass looked at it and said, "Oh, hey, dragons are cool, I'll take that." I was an idiot in the RPG world at this time. I had no idea where to place my stat numbers to make a good build, and accidentally made Charisma a pretty low stat, even though I was playing a sorcerer. I had luckily rolled a 17 when rolling stats, and placed that into my intelligence because I thought that would make me smarter. Believe me, I have been taught better over the year and a half I've played D&D. The day came where the club met up after school, and I brought the DM my character sheet. This is where I noticed a few things. 1. They were all level 5 instead of level 1. But I quickly got that fixed with the DM. And 2, every player seemed to be playing something crazy, while I was a character that stuck to the normal D&D races and classes. The others seemed to give me some grief with how I made my character, but the DM just looked at it and shrugged it off. It's here where I should mention the cast. DM, a chill guy who ran the game. Me. Parasite, a guy who was a warlock whose patron was a parasite controlling him, from what I remember. Mando. This name comes from the fact that this guy was basically playing something inspired by Star Wars The Mandalorian. He was a bounty hunter rogue who managed to pull off a lot of bullshit. He's the guy who I'll call the instigator of the conflict. Randos. Others who aren't as important to the story, or I can't remember their characters. All I remember was this other guy who played something along the lines of a mind flayer of sorts, but I could be wrong. Once I got my character up to level 5 with the DM, we started the game. The DM set the scene of how this one-shot started with a standard tavern, but this tavern was on a planet of dragons, where the DM planned to introduce my character to the rest of the group. It turns out that this particular group of PCs have been in many one-shot/campaigns before that, involving them hopping across the vast multiverse via space adventures. I'll admit, I liked the concept. My character entered the tavern, and the DM describes how I come across a group of adventurers that look nothing like the dragons I'm used to seeing. Curious, my dragonborn approached the group and said something like, quote, "Never seen you around before. Where are you fellas from?" I immediately get a rude response back from Mando. Quote, "Why the hell would you want to know?" I answered, quote, "Because I've never seen you before." I wasn't used to role-playing this way before, so I was a bit nervous with my replies, not knowing what to say. It's here where the DM lets me know that they are looking for some magic artifact on my planet, and that being a magic user, and an inhabitant of the planet, I would know where it is because plot reasons. I can't remember exactly what backstory reason was used. I agreed to this, just trying to fit myself in well. Me. I know you guys aren't from this planet, so why are you here? Parasite. We're looking for some magic thing that the dragons keep safe here. Do you know where it is? I tell them that I do know where it is, and that I can help them find it if they wish, but I do warn them, thanks to knowledge from the DM, that the artifact is guarded by a silver dragon. They don't seem to mind at all, saying they would fight it if it came down to it. This should have been another red flag, but I didn't own myself a beautiful copy of the monster manual, so I didn't know just how strong silver dragons were, and assumed that the party could take it on. To make a long story short, I led the party out of the tavern and towards the keep of the artifact. On the way, we were ambushed by a group of kobolds, who I tried to use my spells against, but either I think I kept rolling low, and my low charisma certainly didn't help. I did manage to hit a couple of spells, but the party, who had dealt some devastating blows to some kobolds, didn't seem happy with me and showed that in character. Then, out of character, either Parasite or some other players asked to see my character sheet, and I sheepishly agreed, handing it to them. They looked it over and showed a few of the other players, including Mando. They eventually handed it back, and we continued our journey in-game. After some puzzles and other encounters, we finally made it to the den where the artifact was kept, and our party prepared for what would potentially be a big fight. But before we entered, Mando said something along the lines of, quote, "I take out my black lightsaber and point it at the Dragonborn." Safe to say, I was baffled. Not only did this bounty hunter somehow have access to a lightsaber with a black kyber crystal, but now he wanted to kill my character out of nowhere. Parasite also got in on this and argued with Mando that instead of killing me, he should instead possess me with a parasite of his to become the party's servant or something. The DM seemed open to let either idea slide. I should have put a stop to this, but I genuinely believed that this was part of the game, and that I couldn't do anything about it. Mando eventually won the argument, and went on a monologue about how my character, quote, "did their job already," and that I was no longer needed. He described using his lightsaber to cut my character's head off and taking it as a trophy. When I looked around the table, I guess I had this expression of, "why?" on my face, which prompted either Mando or another player to say something like, quote, "Yeah, your build was kind of stupid, so we didn't think you would help during the final fight." I agreed to this and stayed for the rest of the session, since I had to wait for my parents to pick me up from the school. I can't remember most of what happened, but I do know that they won the fight against the dragon through some attacks that my DM self today would call out as BS. The DM said to me after the session that I could make another character, but I said no and never went back to that club. I remained friends with the guys from the session, since players like Parasite and Mando were part of the video game club, but when the virus hit, we gradually drifted apart, especially when I moved to a new state. Now, I am an avid D&D player and DM myself, with a tightly knit group of friends that I always play with online. The session with my Dragonborn getting killed still haunts me with the thought that my characters will always be useless, but I'm much better at putting together builds with 5e, and maybe I'll bring that Dragonborn back someday. I'm sorry if my memory with the story did leave some plot holes though. TLDR, I, a new player, join a one-shot where I lead the party to an artifact only to get killed by the Mandalorian once my purpose has been filled because my build is, quote, stupid. At first, it seemed like Mando was just playing his character to be an asshole, which is fine. There can be some interesting characters that can start out as pricks, as it can leave room for some good character development. Though, unfortunately, it seems like the character matched the player in this case. And don't get me wrong, everyone else isn't safe from criticism either in this story. If the other players didn't like how OP's character sheet was formulated, they could have offered some advice, seeing how they were a new player. Though, instead, they decided to give OP a bad experience by just killing his character, simply because they didn't think he would help in the last fight. Any good DM at that point would have stopped that right then and there. I know I've said it before, but I find myself having to say it over and over again. I hate stories like this, when it's someone new to tabletop RPGs, and something like this happens. It could turn them away from something they'd otherwise find amazing and fun. Thankfully, it sounds like OP kept on playing with other people. Let's move on to the next story. This was my very first time playing D&D, by Reddit user Saucy Tacos. During my freshman year of community college, I lived in the dorms and was making friends, having fun, and eventually I was invited by a friend to join a D&D group. I agreed, and we all met for our first session, and being new, I was super excited. For some context, there was about 7 of us all together, and we met in the men's side of the dorms in the study room that was large enough to fit us all. I already knew most of the people since we all lived in the dorms together, and one of them, the DM, was not my favorite person. He creeped me out and wore little tiny circle glasses, didn't take care of himself, and would always randomly pull me into hugs and squeeze me, even with his girlfriend in the room. I asked him to stop a few times, but he never did. DM had me sit right next to him and gave me a character sheet that was already filled in, and the character was very heavily sexually made. I didn't even get to choose my race or class, which I was looking forward to. I felt a little out of place, since everyone else came with their characters that they made themselves, and were comparing stats and such. I wasn't told any rules or anything, just kind of thrown in. Anyways, now for the good part. DM started us in a tavern and the town was being attacked by bandits or something, and DM basically told me what to say even though I wanted to do something else. DM got my character drunk by making her stay in the tavern drinking, while others went and dealt with the attack. That was basically the first and only session I played with this group, and here's why. DM messaged me on social media saying that he was having a session that day at a designated time, though I was in a class at the time he wanted to start, and I already told him I wasn't able to play on the weekdays because of classes, and that I worked as an RA for the dorms. He said it was okay, and he wasn't planning to do anything crazy, so he would keep my character in the tavern and just keep the others within town doing another quest, so I wouldn't be left behind. I agreed, and a few days later, on the weekend, he messaged me again asking if I was available for another session. I said yes since I wasn't working or going to any classes, and showed up to the study room at the designated time. Their group was smaller, maybe 3 people weren't there, so I was a bit confused when I sat down, as I was a couple minutes past the start time because I had to have someone let me into the building. I asked DM's girlfriend where everyone was, and she shrugged. I turned to the DM and asked for my character sheet, and he handed it to me. I noticed that I had a level up applied and asked about it since I didn't play the last time, and he ran me through the events of the last session. Trigger warning here. While I was gone, he played my character for me, and while she was in the tavern, she decided she wanted to go to the guard barracks, and while in there, she was violently sexually assaulted by a group of guards. He explained it all in detail, and once he was done, I looked around at the others, who were all either laughing or staring in disgust. At this point, I stood and left, never returning to the group. I talked to a couple of the people who didn't show up, and they said they didn't want to play with him after he did that to me. They felt it was gross, and I couldn't blame them because I felt absolutely violated with him doing that. I saw him around a few times after that happened, and he squeezed me still, but he moved out a few months after, so I was extremely happy I wouldn't have him around anymore. This was my story I've been dying to tell people since 2016, so here you go. Has anyone else been in a situation like this? Jesus Christ. Another story like this. Why and how do people think it's okay to do stuff like this in game, especially to someone's character who isn't even there? I can understand why some of the players didn't show up again after that, and then for some of the other players to start laughing when the DM told OP what had happened to her character is all sorts of cringy and creepy. I don't blame OP for up and leaving right then. And then for that creep of a DM to still give OP unwanted hugs after she told him that she obviously didn't want anything to do with him anymore after up and leaving is super creepy. Thankfully, he left the college after a while and OP didn't have to see him around anymore. Though, have you ever experienced people like this when first getting into tabletop RPGs? If so, feel free to vent about it in the comments. If you have a story that you would like to be read on the channel, you can post it below in the channel subreddit r/D&D Doge, or even just at me on Twitter. As always, I appreciate all of you, and hope all your rolls are natural 20. Until next time.